This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. This is episode number 258. I'm Jamie Bogner, and joining me is Tom Shellhammer, professor at Oregon State University and a research scientist who does a lot of work in the world of hops. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thanks, Jamie.
I've quoted your work in the past on numerous occasions, or over the last number of years of the podcast. It's been fascinating to read some of the work that you're doing to help brewers and help the hop industry understand what is going on with hops. You've got a fantastic new study that explores in a research and scientific basis the idea of hop terroir. And that is what we're going to talk about on the podcast today, what the parameters of hop terroir are, what some of those influencing factors are, the things that hop terroir can influence, the things that it can't, and trying to get a broader, better understanding of what that means when we use a term like terroir with hops. I'm excited to dive deep into this. Obviously, we're coming into harvest season. Actually, we are in harvest season right now.
Correct.
And
yep.
Hops are coming off the vines in Oregon and in Yakima now, and so it's exciting. I'm going to head out to Yakima in a few more weeks. Just
we've got graduate students running around the valley right now, just collecting hop samples. We're getting ready to head out to the field for a big study in a week as well. So, it's time.
Cool. So in the spirit of this timing, and because it is the season for that, we are going to talk about hop terroir. Before we do that, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chillers' new microchannel condensers. G&D's microchannel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks, along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chillers engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, still emptying those overflowing waste bins full of low fills, crushed and damaged cans, or undercarbonated beer every canning day? It's time to fill like a pro. Email contact us at probrew.com. For more information on ProFill can fillers from ProBrew, ProFill can fillers use rotary true counterpressure gravity filling and seaming technology to run at speeds of 100 to 300 cans per minute with less than 30 parts per billion DO pickup and less than 1% product waste at the filler. Stop wasting perfectly good beer. Email ProBrew at contactus@probrew.com today. ProBrew is a subsidiary of Technoblend, now a ProMock brand. So, Tom, we normally kick off the podcast talking about some background. Talk to me about yours. What led you down this path of becoming a professor, but then also focusing on so deeply on hops and research around hops?
Yeah. So I grew up in a family with a college professor. My father was a biological sciences professor, so I suppose I have that in the family. But when I was done with college, I wasn't really thinking I wanted to become a scientist. I did go to graduate school in food engineering. Actually, it was food science, but with a focus on food engineering, and then went to work in the food industry for a while. But as I was working for General Mills, this kind of nagging thought in my mind around doing more science and kind of exploring the academic route was there. And so I went back to graduate school and worked on a degree in food engineering. And then when I got done, I ended up working at Ohio State University as a food science professor and as a food engineer. And it was like during graduate school when I was working on food engineering, Michael Lewis, who was the brewing professor at Davis and was my brewing professor when I was an undergraduate there studying fermentation science, asked me to do some training work for students who were interested in preparing for an international exam offered by the Institute of Brewing. It's now the IB, Institute of Brewing and Distilling. And so I was kind of marrying my fermentation science undergraduate background, which was in wine and beer, with my food engineering stuff. And it was like, this is kind of cool. And it was kind of a fun side hustle when I was in graduate school and didn't realize that it would like end up being a long-term career for me. So when I got done, I actually worked for a little while with Michael and another fellow, Ashton Lewis, in a small consultancy. And then we did some teaching as well for the University Extension program, the Master Brewers program at Davis. which Michael was running. And that was right after graduate school. And then I ended up looking for an academic job and getting one at Ohio State. Worked there for 4 years. And in 2000, the position I'm in now opened up. It's a brand new position at Oregon State University. They had started a fermentation science program in 96, built with inside the food science department. So they're taking existing faculty who had an interest in fermentation, so wine and beer principally, created some coursework, and Jim Bruneau, who was the owner of the Nor'Wester Brewery at the time, and also is the owner of Willamette Valley Vineyards, made a gift of some equipment as well as a small endowment to kind of kick off the fermentation science program. He saw that there was a need for training in Oregon for people who wanted to go work in wineries and breweries, and there really wasn't anything, anywhere other than Davis or Siebel. So he kind of that the gift of the equipment and that endowment was like a catalyst for getting things going. And after about 4 to 5 years or so of it being sort of homegrown, the university approached the state, and the state released money for 2 positions: a brewing scientist, brewing chemist, myself, which is the position I'm in, and then a wine chemist as well. And so that was kind of the first positions at OSU that were dedicated just for fermentation on both the wine and beer side. And since my arrival, we've hired a wine microbiologist, and then a brewing microbiologist, and a distilling professor. And so it kind of expanded out. And then we've hired a bunch of other staff on the fermentation science. So fermentation science still sits within food science, but it's got a lot more horsepower than it did in 96. So anyway, long story short, in 2000, Michael sends me an email, says, "Hey, there's this position at Oregon State that has your name all over it. You should apply for it." And I did, and competed with the other applicants, and they said yes to me. And I came out here in 2001, and and started my career here. And really it was around teaching students around beer and brewing. And we're a tier 1 research university, line grant research university. So part of my remit is to carry out research that is important to the stakeholders in the state and the nation, which would just be brewers, and also, as it's turning out to be now, hop growers and barley growers. And so, when I got here, I was like, okay, where can I make my mark, and what can I start doing work in that's going to be either interesting or fundable? And OSU has had a long history of hop research in collaboration with the USDA, going back to the 1930s, when the USDA created a hop breeding program here in Corvallis. And it's kind of this interesting joint venture. It's like varieties like Willamette and Cascade and quite a number of other public varieties have come out of this public breeding program at USDA. And the most of the sweat is coming from federal scientists, USDA scientists, but it's using equipment at OSU. So it's the land that the hop yard on is OSU, and some of the technicians that are supporting this are also OSU. So it's an interesting federal and state kind of mashup. So to be clear, the Cascade was developed by USDA scientists, not OSU scientists. But it's done here at OSU. And so we had this long history of hop work. And so I kind of stuck my toe in the water back in 2001 to do some hop work with the Hop Research Council. And it's just sort of snowballed over 20 years. I've kind of made a name for myself as a hop scientist. And I do work in other areas as well. I do work in barley. I work closely with Pat Hayes on barley breeding projects and looking like, we're talking about terroir today, doing terroir on the barley side. But I would say most of my work is tied in some way with hops, whether it's from the brewing side or more recently with hop growing side. That's where the terroir studies kind of come from, working closely with hop growers. And so a big part of my daily work is doing research. In fact, my appointment at OSU was much larger on research than it is on teaching. I mean, I still teach courses for students to learn about brewing and run a continuing education program on the same realm. But the research element is like what the university is looking at me to, that's where the heavy lifting comes.
Sure. If we look at it from, the last 22 years, 21 years since you've been in this kind of role, I mean, the value, commercial value of the US hop crop is, I don't know, 300 to 400% what it was when you started in this.
Yeah,
That
it's really
I
changed.
think we're
Yeah,
over $600 million a year or so. I think, and last I checked, I could be off on that. Somebody fact check me on it. But I mean, it's a humongous increase in the overall value, not just volume, but value.
yeah,
Of the hop crop, and of course, as this advent of craft beer really took hold and over the last 15 years has become an economic and powerful force, the agriculture has been the thing that also supports, inspires, and furthers the success of that, and then working in tandem. Of course, that's also driven, I think, what you're talking about, more need for and demand for understanding, knowledge, and information about these things. And it's been fascinating to see what you've been able to show, so that growers can be more effective at what they do, which is making agronomically viable hops, growing them in a way that makes sense on the agricultural side, but also makes sense on the flavor side, so that they're serving the needs of the customers, aka brewers that are using the hops that they make.
yeah. In the 21 years that I've been here, hops. I mean, hops have gone from being kind of a commodity to very much a specialty ingredient. I mean, it's really interesting to see the evolution of that. We were not talking about varietal specific hop beers. I mean, you could sort of predict it was coming because you can see the increasing sophistication of the craft beer drinker, and that evolution mirrors a lot of what the wine industry saw in the 70s. As I grew up in California, so my dad was kind of in that, going from just drinking jug red or white wine to being in wine tasting groups and wanting varietal specific wines, and then not just wanting varietal specific wines, but wanting varietal specific wines from certain regions, from Napa or from Central Coast or France or wherever. And so I
And
could
now we're
kind of
down to
see that.
block. And now we're
I
down to
know.
block.
Oh, exactly.
South facing
Facing
slope.
slope of a certain
We've
clone of Pinot Noir
right.
grown in this block and this other block. I mean, the price differential that these winemakers can create, this block is $60 a bottle and that block is $120 a bottle. It's like, wow, okay, that's an example of kind of where terroir could potentially go, right? So
Sure, sure. Well, let's talk about what hop terroir is and like the basis of this study, because we throw around that term, and I think a lot of people have different ideas of what that means. But before we get into that conversation, are you looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough? Think outside the puree box. Let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies the craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzer, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Hey Nano Brewers, Fermentis, the obvious choice for beverage fermentation, is soon offering their dry ale and lager yeasts in flexible 100-gram packaging. To learn more about how Fermentis can improve the quality of your fermentation and for the latest on their exciting new product releases, visit fermentis.com. So when we talk about terroir, how do you define that, Tom, and how did you start setting out to devise a study that might, what become those factors that you consider to be terroir, and then how did you set out to define those and study those?
yeah, so yeah, two really good questions. So first, let's deal with what terroir is, or and some people will refer to it as regional identity. It's the concept that an agricultural product is influenced by the region with which it's grown in, or in which it is grown, and these characteristics of this product, why they can be influenced by a number of things. There are some elements that are very expressive of that place and very unique because of that place. And so the kind of key things, like the two main things that people focus on, are soil and weather or climate. So climate is basically weather over a long period. Weather is what we experience on a day-to-day basis. So climate, why we think about climate from like the study, we focus on weather, like what happened over the 4 month growing season, and then we look at soil as well. For I think there's another element of what we call geomorphology. And we've already just kind of joked about that, like the south-facing slope of this, vineyard. Um, Certainly for where the growing space is, the microclimate, in addition to the overall climate and weather patterns. But that microclimate will have an influence. And we see this a lot with grapes. So grapes high up on a hill have different weather patterns than those that are down in a valley. There's a lot, the cold air settles in the valley. And if it's south facing, it gets more sun than if it's, west facing or north facing. We don't really see the geomorphology. I don't really see that as being a big deal in the US, because when you look around the US, most of the hop fields are flat. In Germany, there is some slight rolling to them, but it's nothing like what you see in terms of where wine grapes are going. And particularly like in Germany, my gosh, in the Moselle Valley, they grow on these super steep slopes and very much on the south facing side because it's really cold where these wine grapes are grown. But so geomorphology is probably not a deal for hops. I mean, we do know the altitude that they're grown at, but still, it's not a biggie. So really, soil and weather. The plants are very photosensitive. So the way hops are perennial plants. The rootstock stays in the ground year after year, and every year, the kind of an annual portion emerges, and it starts growing and growing and growing. And the mechanism that triggers flowering is a increase in nighttime length. So the nighttime length is getting shorter and shorter as we approach solstice, and then once we get past solstice, it's the change in night length. I mean, you can think of it as day length, but it's really triggered by the night element. That's then the plant says, okay, hey, we're moving into like summer, and that triggers the sequence of flowering, which then those flowers then turn into cones. And so the latitude of the plant will have a significant influence on day length. So the further north you get, it's really good for hop growing, but you run up against an upper bound where you just don't have enough of a growing season. So 35 to 45 degrees north or south of the equator is kind of the sweet spot. Well, not sweet spot, that's the band. Like 45 degrees, which is where Salem, Oregon is a nice sweet spot. It's where the Hallertau is in Germany. So latitude will certainly have an influence on hop. That's my intuition on hop expression. And then there's these other elements that, like, some people will say that this is not part of terroir, and I've heard other people argue that it is part of terroir, and that is the management practices. So we often think of terroir being those regional influences that work irrespective of the management practices, but it's hard to decouple that, because a grower who is growing hops in a very sandy soil, let's say near a river, will need to apply more fertilizer than a grower who is growing, on much more clayey soils that are less easily drained, have a higher water holding capacity, and might have more organic matter. So the fertilizer inputs will be different because they're responding to what's in the soil. And the same thing goes for disease and pest resistance. If there is, hop growers are really, at least in Oregon and Washington and Idaho, are battling fungal diseases. So they're going to spray, and part of that spraying has to do with where the hops are grown. So if they're grown, if there's a particularly hard year, you got lots of humidity, it's going to influence fungal disease pressure. So it can't really take the management element out of this. So those are kind of the three gross things, right? So we've got soil, we've got weather/climate, and we've got management practices. And those are the big influences. And then there's the variety of the hops, the hop variety itself. And I guess we've kind of veered off of just what is terroir, but what is terroir to hops. But the hop variety is going to have an influence, as would other agricultural products. The type of the variety may be either more or less susceptible to these environmental differences. And that's kind of it. So you see this expressed in other crops, probably most notably wine grapes. And the U.S. has these AVAs, these American Viticultural Association areas, that are tied to regions that provide unique characteristics. So, for instance, Pinot Noir grown in the Willamette Valley, there's a Willamette Valley AVA, just like there is a Carneros region AVA down in southern Napa, or a Columbia River AVA. And if you grow Pinot Noir in those different areas, it's going to be Pinot Noir, but they're going to be different because of those regional influences. We see the same thing with coffee. You see regional identity coffee. You see the same thing with cocoa, regional ID cocoa. Some things with tea. We've done some work at OSU on dairy. There's sort of terroir influences on milk and how that influences cheese production. So it happens in a number of different agricultural products. And so it's not surprising that some growers would say, well, if it's happening in wine grapes and I've got a field of hops that's basically right across the street from wine grapes, is it happening in hops?
Sure.
And that was sort of how the project got kicked off, was a grower asking that very question.
So it's a massive problem with all like multivariate inputs and all sorts of things that are influencing the expression of different things. You've got, the potential for different varieties of hops to express these things in different ways. They've got different amounts of different compounds that interact with each other to produce the different kinds of things that you can sense and measure. All of these things work on a whole bunch of different axes at all the same time.
All at the same time, exactly.
It's a massive problem, but you want to study it.
Right, so, and that's a challenge, right? Because as scientists, we like to have very balanced and randomized design. So in this case, balancing would be, we'd like to have all different soil types with all different weather types, right? And we can't get that because the soil is influenced by the weather, right? The soil in Yakima Valley is different than the soil in the Willamette Valley because of the climate and how much rain there is in the Willamette versus how much rain there isn't in the Yakima Valley. So we don't have a true comparison of, let's say, Yakima Valley soils in Willamette Valley weather. Although I have heard somebody suggest that basically grow plants in very large pots and move them around, and then you can have all soils. And that's, I don't know, I don't know what the spatial dimension of that would be. So that's one of the challenges. And then you have, it's like all these different things that we're trying to nail down, because we want this to be a study looking at the regional influences, not the effect of either the agronomic influences or maturity influences, or who knows what. And so it's a challenge to measure a lot of things, try to control things to as much as we can, and so that's.
So how did you set this study up? I mean, knowing that you can't study everything, but that taking this step forward, it needs to lay a base for future research also.
Totally.
What did you decide to actually study, and how did you decide to study and measure that?
So we had kind of two parts of the project that we're focused on. One is trying to establish whether there is a regional, whether there are differences, chemistry and sensory differences that we can tie to region. So part of it is measuring chemistry and sensory of hops growing from different regions. And then if there is some difference, can we begin to describe why those differences occur? Like what are the factors that would drive those differences? And so that's taking all this data in the soil weather management space. So it's a lot of data collection. We had done some preliminary work in 2018 with Coleman Ag, and then we did a much more thorough study in 2019. So we'd had some, we'd been around the track twice at least, and was learning as we went. In 2020, when we did this multi-state project, we went from working with one grower to working with 23 growers. And, we're sort of like a slight nuisance or annoyance to them, right? They're trying to grow hops and process hops, and we're trying to work with them. And most hop growers are very willing to say, come on the farm, grab soil samples. You can grab hop samples. But we decided to not try to intervene from a agronomic perspective. We just said, you just treat your fields the way you normally would. You apply the amount of fertilizer you would. Just let us know how much you're applying. You spray as you need. Just let us know how many sprays. So we could kind of tally this up at the end and try to find some differences there. Probably the biggest thing to control, and this is probably the area where we have the it's the most, whatever, I guess not tenuous, but just the part that is the the biggest challenge is just maturity. We know from other work that we've done in our lab and work that we're continuing to do in our lab that harvest maturity has a really significant influence on hop quality. And it's pretty dynamic. And it's in a period of just a few weeks. It goes from being, hops can be vegetative, bell peppery, green, grassy, to all of a sudden, boom, all this citrusy. And then, you wait a little bit longer and now they become these onion garlic bombs. And so we'd like to have the hops all at a similar maturity. The other challenge to that, though, is that there's no uniform measurement of maturity. We've got some growers that use tactile senses. That is, they basically, pick cones and feel them in their hands and kind of squeeze them between their fingers. Look at them visually. We have other growers that do dry matter measurements. The hops dry matter tends to increase as the hops mature on the vine. They'll use a dry matter window. I know other growers that use a combination of dry matter and some chemistry. I know another grower that uses just all chemistry, really, really advanced gas chromatography. And then I know other growers that just say hops are photosensitive. We pick every year on this date, give or take one day. And it's really interesting how, like, year upon year, they're picking whatever cascade on this day. It's like, the Colemans pick on whatever. It's like August 18th, they start picking Centennial. And with very few exceptions, it changes. So everybody's got their own sense of when they're going to pick. And I think that was one of the biggest struggles here, is that we wanted to try to get some uniform maturity. And I would say our dry matter data, while it is variable, is not drastically variable. And we can correlate some of the dry matter data. But just like staying in this hop maturity space for a minute, you might have the same grower who's picking the same variety on two different plots of land, and within a day of each other, because of like this photosensitivity, the plants all seem to be ready. But those plants might actually have fairly different dry matters, right? So if they were going to wait for the plant that had the lower dry matter to have higher dry matter, they might wait another week, and that plant might be, from a sensorial perspective, overripe relative to its partner that's grown a few miles away. So that's kind of the evidence of how dry matter is not like the holy grail from maturity.
I mean, these are plants within the same row on the same hill. You
Yeah.
might have, this variance in the dry matter.
Oh, you just go up and down the column of the plant. Like if you
Yeah.
walk out in a hop field and you pick cones that are like 5 feet off the ground, and pick cones that are maybe 12 feet off the ground, and then pick cones that are 20 feet off the ground, you'll find different oil amounts, different chemistries, and different dry matters throughout the vertical column of the plant. And so, yeah, it's a relatively heterogeneous plant. I mean, it is all maturing, but it's not like every cone on the plant is the same. Much like if you go out to a vineyard and look at grapes, they particularly, when they're not quite ripe, you'll see broad variations in color and whatnot. So that's kind of one of the challenges, dealing with the heterogeneous nature of that. So we would let the growers make the call on when they're going to harvest, and it was just a matter of communication that we got out there in front of their harvesters so that we could get our samples out of the field before them. So that for us meant in 2018, we actually tagged all the plants that we wanted. We needed about 15 strings of mosaic and 20 strings of cascade to get roughly the quantities of hops that we needed. We were looking for between 12 and 15 pounds of dried hops to do all the different studies and brewing trials and whatnot, and have some backups. So we would go out and hand harvest these plants and then bring them to a mobile picker, pick the hops, and then put them in big kiln cloth bags. They're like kind of like giant onion bags. And then we'd bring them over to a grower and have them dry it for us. So Coleman Ag would dry all the hops for us in the Willamette Valley, and Peralt Farms up in Yakima Valley would dry all the hops. Actually, they would pick for us, and John A. Haas, the Golding Farms, would do all the drying. So that was one way to try to control one variable. Have all the hops grown all throughout the valley, but have one person or one entity picking them, and one entity drying them, and drying them consistently at the same temperature. That being said, the hops they may be dried with other varieties, right? So it's like a big hop farm's going, and we're picking hops from different parts of the valley. Not all the Cascade hops were dried in kilns with Cascade, right? There might be some Centennial, there might be some other variety, might be some Simcoe, because that was in the kiln at the time. But Haas dries all their hops at the same temperature and the same bed depth. So they're essentially getting the same roughly the same treatment. They may be in the kiln a little bit longer, depending upon the hops that are being dried with them.
15 pounds of dried hops within the size of an average hop kiln is
Yeah,
a literal drop in the
in the
bucket.
bucket, exactly. So that was one way to try to control things, is have the the grower, they're being dried commercially along with other varieties, and then being pelletized.
Sure. Why focus on Cascade and Mosaic
Mosaic,
in
right?
particular?
Yeah, so we focused on Cascade. Well, in order to do the study and get a decent data set from a regional perspective, that is, lots of different samples across a broad region of both the Willamette and the Yakima valleys, we needed varieties that were grown in many places. So the candidates would be those top 3 or 4 varieties. So Cascade, Citra, Mosaic are big ones in terms of acreage. And so Cascade was a good choice because it's sort of a heritage variety. It's public, it's grown all over the world, and it's got a lot of acreage in the Northwest. So that was easy to find growers who grow Cascade. The Mosaic selection came because of work we had done in 2019 with Coleman Ag. We had looked at Simcoe Mosaic and Strata, and the Mosaic data of the 3 varieties seemed to show more regional variation than the others. And so, like, okay, well, we got some preliminary data that seems to point to Mosaic showing some regional variation. So let's use that as a candidate hop. We know that we could find enough growers to grow Mosaic on all the different spots of land, not spots of land, but the basic let's call it the subregions of the Willamette Valley and the Yakima Valley.
So having some bias towards wanting to have a result of any kind, you found something that might express a little more variance.
Variation,
Now
right?
these the hop and oil composition of those are a little bit different from each other, and so you're also then potentially tracking different compounds within each one of those, which might give you a little more breadth to see if there are certain compounds that get more influenced by terroir than others.
Yeah, exactly. So it's nice to have 2 varieties that are also different sensorially, right? So the kind of key descriptors for Cascade are citrusy, maybe piney, herbal, slightly floral aromas, while the Mosaic is very much citrusy, tropical, almost it can be sort of stinky, tropical kind of aroma. It can move into that onion garlic space as well. So the former, Cascade, is more driven by terpene and terpene alcohol derived aromas. There's not a lot of free thiol expression in Cascade, while Mosaic has terpene alcohols, but it's got a strong influence from thiols as well. So it's a more thiol dominant, free thiol dominant type of variety. So that's where those passion fruit guava, dank, stinky smells come from. So that was nice to have 2 varieties that were different in that regard. It wasn't just comparing oranges to tangerines. It was like, okay, a little more apples to oranges.
So 15 pounds of samples from each of these different locations. How many different farms and locations?
Yeah,
was this across each of the states?
Yeah, we're targeting 10 spots within each state for each variety. So we had 40 samples total in this study, roughly 20 of Cascade and 20 of Mosaic in each of the states. It didn't quite work out that way because because in 2020 we had this crazy forest fires at Labor Day, and so one of the sites was under an evacuation order over in Mount Angel, so we just stayed away from that farm. So we lost one there, but I think we were up one in Washington. We might have had like 11 sites there, or maybe even 12 sites. It was just a little bit out of balance there, but in the end, we had roughly 10 sites of each. I think the 2020 study, we had 39 sites in total, split roughly evenly between Cascade and Mosaic, and again split roughly equally between the Willamette and the Yakima valleys.
So you had these hop samples then pelletized. What steps did you all take after that?
Yeah, so we pelletized the samples, then put them in cold storage. We evaluate the hops from a chemistry perspective using sort of your standard techniques to look at the hop acid composition and moisture content, but then also total oil content and then a range of different oil components using GC. And then we would do hop grind evaluations from a sensory perspective. So we get some sensory data. And with that, we've got then a suite of data, both sensory and chemistry, that we can then do the terroir study, which is like, okay, we do a statistical analysis on them and look like, okay, how do they group? And so the groupings, you can see like, okay, Cascade was different than Mosaic. Okay, they should be. It confirms, yep, they're very different. And then it was interesting to see when we start mashing this data up, we start seeing some state differences, like the Cascade in Oregon was different than the Cascade in Washington. And the same thing with the Mosaic in Oregon and Washington. It wasn't a complete separation, but it was, you could see there was regional effects. It wasn't like these two data sets were just mapped on top of each other. There was, a little bit of overlap in some spots, but a fairly distinct differences. And then from that, we had 40 samples to look at. We're like, oh, this is cool. We're seeing some evidence of this terroir effect. We weren't really in the game of trying to brew 40 different beers and analyze those. So we took a subset of these hops. And basically, so within, let's say, the Cascade batch, we looked at all 20 samples, and we picked 7 samples. So we basically were 3 from each state plus 1 extra there to kind of look at the extremes, shall we say. I wouldn't call it the extremes, but just we were selective of the 3 or 4 samples of the hops from the hop grind chemistry data to collect different points on that map, not necessarily on the geographical map, but on the chemistry sensory map, right? So if hops tended to be high in compounds A, B, and C, and it tended to be intensely tropical versus one that was more citrusy versus one that was more herbal, we were kind of picking those varieties and advancing those to brewing trials. And we did brewing trials at the OSU Research Brewery, and these were like 1.5 to 2 hectoliter brewing trials. So it's made in a research brewery, not like in carboys. And then those beers get processed in single hop IPAs. So it's 6.5% beer, like roughly 2 pounds per barrel of dry hopping and some late hop addition, kettle hop addition, all of the same hop variety. And then we would then do the sensory analysis on those beers to see whether these differences that we're seeing on the chemistry side and sensory side of the hops translated to differences in the beers. And the answer all along the way was yes, there's regional associated differences in the chemistry and sensory. And we could see differences in the beers that were statistically different. They weren't necessarily the same things that we're seeing in the chemistry side, but we are seeing clustering of different groups of flavors that are coming from the hops in the terroir study.
I want to unpack that a little bit more because I think that's the fascinating piece here, that and being able to also understand what you think you're going to get looking at a pure chemical analysis and an analysis of the grind, and then going through the practical application of that through the brewing process to, again, of course, the topic of survivables is a very hot one these days.
Yeah.
To also see, what makes it through that, to actually express some idea of terroir, those or another additional layer. I want to talk about that for a sec, but first, with 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brew houses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From 1/2 barrel to 30 barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com/CBBpod to get started. Also, Arrived, mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts, no monthly fees make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com /CBB, a different kind of POS has arrived. So you had some hypotheses then coming out of the chemical analysis and grind. And then, how did that reflect in those finished beers? What did you see making that you suspect had more impact? And how do you then track all that all the way back to the terroir? And have you been able to figure out, or at least, again, you can't definitively say, but then do you have some guesses or some
Right.
inklings that are leading you into new research directions as to what some of those terroir factors may have actually been that can be influencing those things that do actually make it into the beer? That's another huge question. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a biggie. So, yeah, so from the hop grind perspective and the hop chemistry perspective, we can see differences, pretty clear regionally associated differences. And those differences become less clear, but there's still differences when we move them into beer. And it's not like the data set just maps from what we see in the chemistry space or the hop grind space into the beer space. And I think that's because you point out like the whole issue of survivables that we haven't looked at, like precursors. So like from Mosaic, which has got a lot of, well, and probably even more so Cascade, got a lot of bound thiols. We didn't track bound thiol concentration, nor did we track free thiol concentrations. That's so dang expensive to measure thiols in 140 samples that we could have spent the whole budget just measuring thiols.
You don't have equipment that can measure thiols in parts per trillion?
Trillion,
Come on,
right? Second, no. All right, I know. Mm-hmm. Well, soon, hopefully soon. But yeah, not right now, no. We rely on Nisios over in France to do that for us. And so we're not seeing the full picture from the chemistry perspective. We're seeing a lot, but not the full picture. And so that's kind of part of what makes beer interesting and hoppy beer interesting is that the hoppy flavors that you find in beer are certainly evocative of hops. You can smell the hops and you can smell the beer, but they're not the exact same thing. It's not like we're just making hop tea. And so there are these biotransformations. We've got stripping effects and solubility issues, and so it's still relatively complex to be able to make some sort of predictions. So we're seeing these differences in the beer space, and it's confirming that, okay, there are these regional differences. We are hanging our hat more on the chemistry and sensory of the hops right now, because that's a more robust data set than just having 7 samples of Cascade or 7 samples of Mosaic. The beer part is really more like kind of saying, okay, the difference that we see in the chemistry doesn't just get washed away when we brew with these beers. So that's kind of validating. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is that we really need multiple years of work to sort of validate whether the differences that we saw in 2020 are the same in 2021 and 2022 and 2023. We, in fact, have done the 2021. We've collected data in 2021. So we're digging into that right now to kind of get a sense on how much similarity is there. How much do these things persist? So I would say I would treat the data that we have as like an interesting proof of concept that these regional differences do exist. And the questions that come up immediately is like, okay, well, 2020 had this huge forest fires. How much did the forest fire influence the Mosaic? We had already harvested the Cascade by then, but the Mosaic certainly could have been influenced. Same thing in 2021. There was a huge wind event in Yakima Valley, blew down a bunch of trellises and just the whole valley had a day and a half of just intense winds. And that had an influence on some of the chemistry as well. So we haven't had like normal years for quite a number of years. So that's in order to kind of get a sense on whether these differences we're seeing really persist. We need to do this for multiple years in order to get a sense whether they do persist. But it's enough. We have enough data to say at least, okay, there are differences. It's not like after 1 year we did this and we're like, everything smells the same. Everything looks the same. We're not there.
And when you start looking at it over multiple years, you also get to see, just how much variance within a single sample from a single field there is based on just the patterns of weather that also occur within that, or whatever the variance in the brand of fertilizer that they may have been using, that,
Yeah,
what all of
exactly.
those.
Yeah, some of the things that we um, like going forward, things that we would do differently are things that we haven't picked up. We haven't really yet talked about like the correlations or the associations, but like irrigation. That's one thing. After that, we didn't ever measure irrigation amount, and it was like in one of the papers we submitted, someone said, "Hey, how much water are these getting? You're talking about rainfall, but these are irrigated. This irrigated agriculture. Yeah, it's interesting to know how much rainfall you're getting in these different regions, but how much total water are you putting on the plants?" I'm like, oh, okay. And we have some of that data, but it's incomplete. So
Water sources for both are probably
probably different,
reservoirs.
but
Yeah,
exactly they're different, right? I mean, it's kind of like the water for Yakima is coming out of that just the watershed to the east, actually to the west, and so it's a lot of it's coming from the Yakima River, um, and here in the Willamette Valley, a lot of it's from the Willamette River, but there's also aquifers that people are drawing from as well. So yeah, water quality could be different. One of the things we did in 2020 is so this kind of transitioned into like trying to make these associations. We have all this chemistry data on the soil. So we did a soil cores and looked at soil within 6 inches of the surface. That would be called surface soil. And then we looked at soil 5 feet from the top, so surface soil measurements, and we know the sand, clay, silt composition. We know the organic matter. We sent soil samples out to have all kinds of analyses done, pH and cation exchange capacity, and all these different mineral levels, and so minerals like macro minerals like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but also micronutrients, so nutrient minerals like iron, copper, boron, zinc, these kind of things. We've got all kinds of weather data. We have 30-year climate data. We have solar radiation data, cloud cover data. Then we have all the sprays, and not so much the type of sprays, but the frequency of sprays. We use the frequency of sprays to get us an idea of how much disease pressure there is on different fields. And back to that soil data, we were also taking samples and having soil microbiome analysis. So we've characterized the at least at a genus level, the different organisms that are in the soil, because there's some belief that the sort of plant microbiome relationship has an influence on its properties. Kind of like you've heard about the human gut microbiome and how like
sure.
gut microflora might actually have influences on like cognitive stuff, like some diseases you have. And we're not talking about like gut related diseases. We're talking about like brain related diseases. And so there's some talk within the wine terroir space that some of the terroir effects may be a function of the microbiome, the kind of the plant microbiome interaction, because it influences nutrient uptake at the roots. So we have that data. We're still unpacking that. We've got a lot of the soil and weather data unpacked. We have some initial correlations, and as you might expect, both soil and weather are having an influence. It seems, based upon the data that we have so far, that soil seems to have a bigger influence than weather. And that may be in part because within, like if you just look within the Willamette Valley, the weather differences, I mean, the climate is all basically the same in the Willamette Valley. There are regional weather differences, like for instance, in the southern part of the valley, at least not the valley, but the hop growing region, there is this, what the wine grape growers refer to as the Van Duzer effect. So there's this Van Duzer corridor where it's kind of a notch split in the coast range, and it allows a lot of coastal breezes to come in from during the summer. So it's foggy and cold on the coast. It's hot inland. So there's this kind of local low pressure gradient that draws coastal breezes into the valley, and they come blowing through this. And in Corvallis, and most summer nights, it's windy and cold here because these coastal breezes are coming in. And as you get further east in the valley, or you get further north up by St. Paul, while there is this diurnal effect, it's not as extreme as you would see down in the southern part of that growing region. So that happens, but overall, the total rainfalls are not that different. The total highs and average lows between, let's say, Independence, Oregon and St. Paul, Oregon are not that different, but the soils are. And so it's not then surprising that from a statistical perspective, we're seeing bigger swings in the data related to soils than we are with weather, because the weather variances are on a much more smaller scale. Certainly between Yakima and Willamette Valley, okay, those are very different from
Right.
um, climate. So the eastern side of the Cascade is high desert. It's dry, much less rainfall, much less cloud cover. So it tends to be colder winters, hotter summers, drier overall, and tend to be a little bit more windier than in the Willamette Valley, which is more temperate, shall we say, much more wetter. So those are gross differences that you see between the two valleys.
Within each area, like how much variance would and I know I am not going to be able to, I don't have the background to understand what the soil difference might be, but how much, for a layperson, how different could those soils be from different parts of the
Oh,
Willamette Valley,
yeah, yeah.
and how different then, what's that kind of range even within, say, just Oregon samples, because naturally you're looking at averages in order to draw some bigger idea of
Sure.
this, but there are always outliers in any data set. You measure, that kind of central trend line, not just, those outliers, but there are still those outliers, those pieces that show that there's even significant difference within a certain environment.
Right. So the cool thing about this project is that I'm not at all a soil chemist, but it got me interested in soil and how soils are formed, and like the Willamette Valley soils and the Aqua Valley soils for that matter. The soils, if we just focus on the Willamette Valley, the soils that we see in the Willamette Valley were formed by this huge flood. If you've seen the movie Ice Age, the kids movie, like the big ice dam that breaks apart and creates this huge flood. That's essentially what happened about 40,000 years ago or so. Actually, it happened repetitively for quite many years, and we're talking like over different millennia. Um, but during the ice age, we'd have these huge ice dams build up in the area around western Montana, and they would eventually break loose, and we'd have this giant wall, like hundreds of feet tall wall of water emptying into what is heading westward into parts of what is now the Aqua Valley, and then depositing all this silty soil into what is now the Willamette Valley. And those are referred to as the Missoula flood silts or Missoula flood deposits. And that's what creates the kind of the basis of all the soil in the Willamette Valley. Superimposed or within that, you have all this, because it's so wet here, you have all this alluvial soil. So you got water runoff from snowmelt and whatnot that is carving paths through the soil in the valley and creating all this river alluvium. So the soils tend to be more, the alluvial soils tend to be more granular, have higher sand, less silt, although you can find some alluvial soils that have a lot of clay, but most of them tend to be much more sandy. And so those are kind of the two gross types of soils. I think in this study we probably, I should count it up, be able to say it off the top of my head, but probably in the Willamette Valley, probably 10 to 12 different soil types. But the gross classifications of those would be different types of alluvial soils and different types of these glacial deposits or the glacial flood deposits. And what the growers in the valley loosely refer to that as river bottom soil and terrace soil. So if you're like in Salem or Kaiser and you're driving through like along River Road or French Prairie Road, you'll be going by hop fields, and then every once in a while you'll kind of drive down off of this terrace down next to the river, and there's like a good 75 feet difference in elevation. And so when you're down below that, you're clearly in the river, the area where the river has carved itself through the valley. And the growers talking to them, they know that the hops grow differently on river bottom soil than they do on the terrace soil. So they're already knowing that there's some differences there. And so we're seeing that. We're seeing, some big differences related to soil, basics, gross morphological differences in the soil because of where they are. And these are going to be within, you could have two fields within a quarter mile of each other, one up on the terrace and one down on the river bottom soil. same grower, same variety. So you got the same management philosophy, but two very different types of soils that they don't create very different hops, as far as we can tell yet, but they have an influence on hop quality. I'm
Sure.
not sure. Did I answer your question about?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I want to zoom out and talk about that kind of sensory impact and some of the, the broader characters that in that sensory testing, that you found reflected. And before we finish up here, talk to me
Sure.
a little bit about that. Like what ended up being the kind of net effect that you were seeing and the kind of broader strokes of difference amongst the different terroirs that you looked at in terms of measurable, but also like sensorially apparent differences in these
Yeah.
things.
So one of the things that we're trying to do, well, the kind of core thing we're trying to do with the study is look at these qualitative differences in soil. I'm sorry, in hop qualities. But we weren't shooting for, okay, who grows the best hops, who grows the worst hops. It's kind
Right,
of
right.
that thing to keep in mind that with terroir, it's not about, okay, this region is good, this region is bad, or the hops, of this nature are good and bad. We're looking at, from our sensory methodology, we're using this approach called check all that apply, which is looking at the frequency with which a panel identifies a particular attribute being present in a particular hop or a beer. So we're not even scaling the intensity of citrus. It's just like citrus is on the ballot. And if 80% of the panel says this sample has citrus, it's a pretty important descriptor for that sample versus another sample in which, let's say, 60% of the people says it has citrus. It doesn't mean the one that has lower citrus is devoid of citrus. It just means it has less citrus and it has more of something else, right? So we're seeing these differences. So some hop samples would have more citrus or more tropical. Others were more herbal. Some tended to be more floral. Some tended to just be lower in aroma in general. So their scores in general were reduced. But I would say we're not at a point yet to characterize regions or subregions as, okay, this region, I can say, is going to be the tropical region of the Willamette Valley for growing mosaic. We're not at that point yet, and I'm hesitant to go there because that I don't want people to run with that. That kind of gets back to that we need to do this for a few more years to get a sense on, okay, what are some gross differences between, let's just say, Willamette Valley and the Yakima Valley, because I think that's an easier one to approach. Back to your question of scale of differences. One of the things that we did see, though, is that the variation between these two regions were as large as the variation between the two hop varieties, right? So if we're going to look at the chemistry of the hop varieties, and you got these, you look at mosaic and cascade together on a PCA biplot, you see they're spread out. And then when you start looking at the differences in these hops as they're associated with the different regions, almost of the same order of magnitude, right? So that's to give you some scale that you could find different hops, the same hop variety grown in, let's say, one part of the Yakima Valley and another hop grown in a different part of the Willamette Valley. And the differences in the qualitative nature and chemistry of those hops would be of the same magnitude as the differences on average of Cascade versus Mosaic. Right, so they're relatively big. It doesn't mean that the sample that was grown, in one place is devoid of Cascade character. It's just that Cascade character or Mosaic character in all its nuances. Well, maybe it's not that nuanced, right? There's some pretty broad differences, and I think this is partly why brewers go to hop selection, is because not all Mosaic is going to taste like Mosaic or smell like Mosaic. So they want to know what it is. And that's kind of where the goal of the project is, right? Is to be able to help growers and brewers with their selection. If they want variation, it could be nice if at some point you could say, we know in general, the lower valley of the Yakima Valley tends to produce hops that tend to be more expressive of these qualities, while the St. Paul region of the Willamette Valley, the hops tend to be more expressive of these varieties, or these characteristics, right? That's kind of where this could ultimately go.
It's fascinating. I think it speaks to something that we all kind of had an inkling toward, that the difference between a Sauvignon Blanc grape grown in Marlborough, New Zealand,
Yep.
and, grown in, Sonoma County, I might be much more significant than the difference between Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Gris grown in one of those. I think you're right. I
It's
think that, but it
exactly.
also
Yep.
it raises that question, like, is looking at solely at hop variety, the way that we should be approaching these things as brewers, or is, maybe you want to look at something beyond that, that,
Yeah. I think,
no,
yeah.
and then of
I think
course,
brewers
yeah,
are built in hops. It's kind of like a color palette metaphor, right? They're looking for creating beers using blends of hops that create flavors that work in a certain space. It's definitely not unidimensional. It's like, okay, if you want a hazy, juicy IPA, you tend to find hops that can give you more of this juicy quality that are, citrusy, tropical flavors, as opposed to other varieties of hops that tend to be more herbal or spicy or floral. And what brewers will do is use varietal as like a surrogate to understand what they think they're going to be getting. And as opposed to just like, here's the color palette for that particular hop. Given that there's many different shades of those colors within Cascade or Mosaic or whatever, and so it's helpful. And certainly this is why some brewers that are very focused on hop aroma will go to selection and identify lots of hops that fit let's call it the aroma palette or aroma color palette that they're seeking to create to build fun and interesting
sure.
beers.
Well, I can't wait to see what future years of this research show and suggest, to see if this starts holding true at the same kind of level of significance across multiple years with different weather and,
Yeah.
all the other concerns that weigh across this. Are there, in addition to this, are there any other research projects that you're working on that, have maybe of interest to our audience of brewers
Yeah.
out there?
I mean, I think a lot of things. We continue to work in the hop enzyme space, the hop creep enzyme, and
Yeah.
basically all this terroir stuff we do. We're always measuring hop enzymes as well to see, okay, can we get some further insight on hop enzymes? I think that's been something that I think brewers are interested in. We're continuing to do kilning work, looking at how hop kilning influences hop flavor, and ways to make hop kilning and hop growing more sustainable. That is, there may be ways that growers could actually reduce the amount of inputs from a kilning and just carbon inputs and create hops that that are great, that smell wonderful and are in no way defective. We're starting to play in the smoke space a little bit. We're doing some preliminary work on smoke, and we'll probably be doing smoke research for the next few years, looking at how smoke influences hops. So that's kind of a stay tuned. Although we'll have some stuff coming out in the new year on some initial smoke work. Yeah, there's a kind of, and then we're doing a fair amount of work on biotransformation. So we're working on looking at how yeast are modifying, particularly the thiol nature of hops. So we got lots more stuff to talk about, Jamie, on another time.
I can't wait, and I'm going to hold you to that because this is all fascinating work, and it's great to see the kind of scientific and data underpinnings to the things that brewers are also learning anecdotally through their practice. And I think looking at it from both of these perspectives can be really valuable as folks figure out how to use all these broader, newer, exciting tools, ingredients, and everything else, yeast and processes that we have to make delicious beer.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's a fun place to be playing in scientifically.
Well, that's a great place to bring this to a close. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. Fill like a pro with ProFill can fillers from ProBrew. Think outside the puree box. With Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends, Fermentus now offers dry ale and lager yeast in flexible 100-gram packaging. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. An arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Of course, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. Let us know this content matters to you. Tom, if people want to learn more about your work at Oregon State and what you're doing in the research world, where can they stay in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I push some stuff out to Twitter, and I'll push some stuff out to LinkedIn as well. You can all my research sits on an OSU webpage that's kind of dynamically updated. So if you just Google Tom Shellhammer at Oregon State, you'll go to my page and you can find my publications. So those are kind of the three areas. So it's follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. So,
well, I can't wait to talk soon about the next project that you're working on and dig into this deeper. But thank you for joining me and talking about hop terroir. Cheers, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Look forward to the next time.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.